Well, hey, welcome back. I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I'm really glad that you've joined me today. Now, one of the things that I like about Compass, our church, is that we aren't afraid to talk about divisive topics here. So whether it's race, politics, whether or not Taylor Swift concert tickets are actually worth the price, we are down to talk about anything. But anytime we talk about something divisive, people tend to choose a side pretty quickly nowadays. And let me just give you just one quick example. Black licorice. Is it good or is it bad? Now, most people have a pretty immediately strong response to that question. Some people like black licorice. They snack on it often. They think it's delicious. While there are others, like me, who think that black licorice tastes like the devil's earwax. But either way, your reaction to black licorice, it's probably a strong reaction. It's kind of a love or hate candy. I don't think there are a lot of people who are out there who are like, oh, you know what I've been craving that I haven't had in a while? Ooh, just some yummy black licorice. Nobody says that because most people either love or hate it. And just like black licorice and Taylor Swift concert tickets, there are a lot of issues in life that seem to have no middle ground. Areas where we need to be all in or all out. And I think that's because people like it when things are black and white. Whether it's something like sports or politics, we want to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. We want to know who's right and who's wrong. We want to know who we are versus. And this is particularly true in religion. When it comes to believing in God, our tendency is to work out our faith by creating black and white handholds that we can then hang on to. Now, understanding God so that we can order our lives around him is a good instinct, I think. But the problem with black and white thinking is that it doesn't make any space for nuance. It can't tolerate gray areas because gray areas create tension that we want resolved. And our aversion to unresolved religious tension can cause us to think that the only way these gray area religious tensions can be resolved is to either believe everything or to believe nothing. Let me give you an example. The book of Genesis in the Bible says that God created the earth in 6 days, 6,000 years ago. Science says it was created over 4.5 billion years ago. Now, a nuanced gray area reading of Genesis might show that the creation account is more Hebrew poetry than it is a historical narrative, and that while God could have created the universe in 6 days, the point of that story is to highlight that he's our creator rather than to historically describe how he created. But this creates tension because the nuanced view of Scripture as literature, it can then be applied to other biblical stories. And where does it end? So if the creation of Adam and Eve, if we look at that as Hebrew poetry, what are the implications for our biblical view of gender and marriage? If the story of Noah wasn't a historical global flood, but it was a huge regional flood, or even if it was a parable meant to communicate something about the character and relationship between God and man, what does that mean for us? And then how do we stop pulling that thread once we started? Notice I haven't given you any answers to this. I've only given you questions, and yet you might already be feeling the massive tension of these potentially gray areas right now. Our need for things to be black and white can cause us to think that we have to believe every Christian principle at a simple surface level, or if we can't do that, then we can't believe any of it. And when that happens, these all or nothing extremes, they drive us to a faith that's either a faith of naive belief on one side or a faith of outright cynicism on the other. But does it have to be this way? Is there a path to following Jesus that can allow both for nuance and true belief? Well, over the next 2 weeks, that's what we're going to be talking about because we're going to look at 2 times when people responded to Jesus with either naive belief or with outright cynicism. And hopefully, we can learn how to follow Jesus in a world that isn't always black and white. So I want to start today by looking at how the people in Jesus' hometown reacted to him. And as we do that, we're going to examine the cynicism that can make any belief impossible. And so we're going to start in Matthew chapter 13, verse 53. When Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Coming to his hometown, he began teaching the people in their synagogue, and they were amazed. So here we find Jesus. He's teaching at the synagogue in Nazareth, which was his hometown. But Nazareth, while it was his hometown, it wasn't his home base. I mean, Jesus didn't live there anymore. His home base was in Capernaum, which was a town about 40 miles away. And so when Jesus returned to Nazareth, after he built a following all over Galilee, and he returned bringing disciples of his own, people who were following him, the people of Nazareth, they wanted to see their hometown boy and find out what all the fuss is about. And judging by the story, it looks pretty good at first, right? I mean, it says they were amazed. But the story continues. Where did this man get his wisdom and these miraculous powers, they asked? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all of his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. Now, before we get too deep into talking about cynicism and its relationship to our faith, let's define it first. Let's define what cynicism is, okay? So cynicism is an attitude that's characterized by a general distrust of the motives of other people. It's the belief that people always act selfishly, and it's a belief that's paired with the sense or an outlook of scornful or jaded negativity. And in this story, we get to see the full evolution of cynicism right in front of us. I mean, the people of Nazareth, they heard Jesus' transformational teaching and even saw him do some miracles. And the story tells us they were amazed by it all. Until some questions started to come up. Like, wait, this is just a local kid. We know his family and there's nothing special about him. And here, now he's portraying himself as some sort of a prophet of God? But where did all that come from? How could a local construction worker who doesn't even have the religious training to be a rabbi, how can this guy say and do the things that Jesus is saying and doing? Now, I was in several bands after college. I played rock music and I loved it. And I had the opportunity to do a lot of touring to play shows around the country. But do you know which shows were the absolute worst to play? Hometown shows. They were just the worst. Because we would go from playing for, 500 or 600 people who were stoked to see us out in Texas or California. And then we'd go to playing these little tiny shows in our hometowns for audiences who, for whatever reason, didn't even really care. Hometown shows, I think they were tough for a couple reasons. I think the first is this. I think it's hard to get excited about seeing an artist this week when you might bump into them walking out of a Walmart bathroom next week, or see them buying milk at the local grocery store, or get cut off by them on the interstate driving home one night. There's also a familiarity that makes it tough. I babysat you when you were a kid, or you sat at my lunch table in junior high. You played guitar in the church band in high school, so why would I pay money to see you now? And then there's also a pride thing, I think, that says, what? You think you're better than me? You think you're bigger than the people you grew up with? All of that combined made playing hometown shows just the worst. And that was how the people of Nazareth reacted to Jesus. I mean, whatever the reason, they had a cynical response, and they decided that they couldn't possibly believe in Jesus. And here, let's look at the result. The story continues in Matthew 13:57. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own home." And he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith. Because of their lack of faith, Jesus didn't do much in Nazareth. Now, if I were writing this, I would probably put it this way. Because of cynicism and their unwillingness to entertain the idea that there might be more to Jesus than they thought, the people of Nazareth cut off their opportunity for Jesus to do anything in their lives. They were unwilling to live with the tension that God might be doing something amazing through a person who they'd seen grow up. person who they were familiar with. But their cynicism, it actually led to more than just a rejection of Jesus. Luke, in his gospel, he gives us a much more fleshed out picture of what happened in this story. We can see it in Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 28. Talking about the people, it says, when they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him and forced him to the edge of the hill on which the town was built. They intended to push him over the cliff. But he passed right through the crowd and went on his way. So this is talking about what the people did to Jesus. And the people of Nazareth were so offended that this guy thought he was a special messenger from God. They were so put off by that they didn't just reject him. They tried to kill him. The reason Jesus didn't do many miracles in Nazareth, it wasn't because their lack of faith somehow limited his ability to do those things. I may be going out on a limb here, but I suspect it's hard to do miracles to help people when they're trying to kill you by throwing you off a cliff. And while the people of Nazareth, they could have remained curiously skeptical of Jesus and taken some time to process what he was saying and doing before making any big decisions, they instead fell back on their black and white, all or nothing thinking, and they labeled him a bad guy. Even though they'd just been amazed by him, they ultimately responded to Jesus with outright cynicism because it was the only way they could make him fit into their worldview. So, what does this mean for us? I mean, what am I supposed to do with this? Well, first, I think we need to ask ourselves a question. Am I cynical? When it comes to issues of faith and religion, is cynicism my default response? Is my attitude negative and skeptical? Do I believe the worst of people's motives? And can I confess, for me, it is. I am a cynical person by nature. But cynicism is also a learned behavior. We pick it up as a defense mechanism to keep from getting hurt. If you've ever been in a bad breakup and you've been really hurt by an ex, it's very easy to be cynical and expect future partners to hurt you in the same way. That's a defense mechanism because not everyone you date will hurt you, but if you expect it from everyone, it might hurt less if and when it happens. And then some of our religious cynicism comes from how other people live out their faith. I mean, if we're being honest, there are a lot of different doctrines, ideas, and practices that exist under this big umbrella of Christianity. And when we take a close look at those differences, especially when we do it with black and white thinking, we can tend to believe that I'm a good guy, which means everyone else over there must be a bad guy. And we don't want to be associated with bad guys. I mean, we don't want people to see us going to the same church as a bad guy and think that we're like them. And then if we think that we share the same faith as bad guys, for some of us, it can cause us to wonder if our entire faith structure is bad too. And maybe you recognize these black and white cynical patterns in your life. The belief that people who differ from you are bad, and that if they're bad, that any system they're part of is bad too. And as a result, maybe you've thought about just rejecting all of it, just like the people of Nazareth rejected Jesus. Maybe like them, your perception of Jesus in the church has caused you to think that if that's what Christianity is, and if that's who it's made up of, I can't believe in any of it. If you, like me, tend to lean towards a cynical response to anything and everything in the church, I want to share with you 3 things that I think we can take away from the story of Jesus in his hometown. And the first of these things is that cynicism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when it comes to relationships especially, cynicism tends to create the outcome that we are afraid will happen in the first place. So for example, if you start at a new school or at a new job, and you believe people there are going to be mean and unfriendly, what do? You put up defense mechanisms to protect yourself if people are mean and unfriendly. So you do things like you don't talk to people, you sit alone by yourself, and you act in ways that will keep people at a distance. And while you're doing it to protect yourself, what you're also doing is communicating to them that you don't want them to talk to you. You don't want to be their friend, and you want to be left alone. Here's what happened. You made your cynical belief that no one will be friendly, you made it come true. And that's how cynicism poisons relationships. I mean, it's exactly what we saw in today's story. The negativity and distrust of the people of Nazareth, it caused them to lash out at Jesus in ways that made it nearly impossible for him to do anything good in their lives. And when we become cynical, we do the same thing. We limit God's ability to move in our lives and in our relationships, in our church. And it's not because he can't, but because our posture won't allow it. Our second takeaway today is that it's okay to be amazed in areas that are gray. Jesus was known for living in gray areas. I mean, he hung out with sinners and prostitutes. He didn't follow the customs or religious rules of Judaism. He taught things that seemed to clearly contradict the Jewish scriptures. And yet at the same time, he was transforming people's lives with his miracles and with his teaching. You may feel God working in your life, but at the same time, you still have questions and uncertainties about Jesus or the church. Gray areas that you want to resolve, but are struggling to. In the same way, the people of Nazareth, they were amazed by Jesus, but they couldn't handle the tension between what they saw and heard him doing and their doubts about him. And I'm not saying they were wrong to be skeptical. I'm a skeptic. But if they had been curiously skeptical rather than outright cynical, their willingness to hear Jesus out, to live in that gray area between their doubts about Jesus and what he was actually doing, that might have allowed Jesus to actually do something amazing in their lives. Sometimes the best way to respond to Jesus is to just be amazed by him and to let him do his thing. You don't always have to figure everything out. You don't have to split the world into good guys and bad guys or resolve every issue of faith, doctrine, and practice. The world of faith, if we're being honest, it's full of gray areas. But it's often in those areas that Jesus does his best work. And then our third and final takeaway today is that Jesus still pursues cynical people. It's amazing to me that Jesus just didn't dip out when the people of Nazareth first started questioning him. Instead, he stuck around, and he stuck around all the way through their attempt to lynch and kill him. But it's because no matter how skeptical or cynical you are, Jesus is still pursuing you. And even when your cynicism closes the door on him, he's still patiently knocking and waiting on the other side of that door. My prayer for us is that whether we have doubts about God or the church or the people who make the church up, that we would be willing to endure the tension of those gray areas. That we would avoid the temptation to try and resolve everything into black and white, and in doing so, either cut Jesus out of our lives or cut out other people who Jesus loves. Because love never gives up. Love never loses faith. It's always hopeful. It endures through every circumstance, especially when life is complex, when it's nuanced, and even when it's gray. So may we be people of love, not cynicism, bearing with each other when it's hard. And may we see Jesus and accept him as he is, not how we want him or expect him to be, but just as he is. Knowing that if we can just sit and be amazed by him, that Jesus has a way of working out all the rest. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.